So in all of my classes, I always recommend getting a fast prime lens. And most of the time what that looks like is a 50mm 1.8 lens. It's one of my favorite lenses. We've had ours for probably 6 years and shoot every single wedding with it still. But what I've found is that some people, when they buy their camera, they get that terrible kit lens, the 18 to 55, and they're trying to get portraits with that, and they're trying to shoot in low light with that, and it just doesn't work. So when I tell them to get the 50mm, they've already spent so much that they don't want to spend another $200 on a lens. But the good news is that you don't have to spend $200 on a lens anymore to get good results. There's a brand that I was introduced to a few years ago, and they're called Yongnuo. I have no idea if I'm saying it right, and I don't know what it means, but it's a Chinese company, and a few years ago I bought their flashes, and I've never turned back. They've all worked well, they're super cheap, and I've just kept going back to this company. So last year, Yongnuo released their 50mm 1.8 lens, and I was super skeptical at first because they had priced it well under $100. I just bought this one for around $60, and I was super skeptical. I didn't even know if it would work, if the autofocus would work. I had no idea why it was so cheap. So I bought it, and I did a couple shoots with it, and I'm gonna tell you, I'm pleasantly surprised. This lens is incredible for the price. This is what I have been shooting with. It's the Sigma 50mm art lens, and it's a f1.4. It was almost $1,000. I think it was $950. So this thing is significantly more expensive than this thing. And instantly what you can tell is this one is a lot smaller, and I'm telling you, it's a whole lot lighter. Why is this one $900 more? So there's only really a few differences that I noticed in real world shooting. So this lens, it is a tad bit sharper, but you will never ever ever notice in real world shooting and real application. Most of my pictures get viewed on Facebook or Instagram or in a gallery online, and those pictures are all downsized. They're not full resolution at 100%. And even at 100%, there's a very, very, very slim difference between these two. So yes, a $1,000 lens is sharper than a $60 lens, but not by much. I think the biggest difference is the autofocus. This autofocuses a little bit slower. This one's a little more snappy, it's a little quieter, it's smoother, but it's not by much. Again, I shot, I think, 3 sessions with this lens, and I had no problems. It wasn't like I was missing the speed or the quietness of this lens. This one was just, I mean, it was good enough. It worked. I've posted pictures on Instagram and on Facebook, and no one's like, oh, you're not using your $1,000 lens. No one can tell the difference. This lens does its job, and it does it well. But there's more to lenses than the sharpness and the autofocus. There's always distortion and the color fringing and vignetting and all of that. This lens has a little bit more vignetting, but that's like one tiny little slider in Lightroom or Camera Raw, and that's fixed. I didn't really notice any distortion, and the color fringing isn't terrible either. I have a lot of Nikon lenses that are a lot worse, especially around the high contrast areas. So this lens is solid. It's a good lens, and I can confidently recommend it to anybody on a budget looking for a 50mm portrait lens. Even if you're not on a budget, this is still a great lens. If you have $400 to spend and you buy this $60 lens, that's still a great idea. This lens is so much more expensive, and it really doesn't give you that much greater results. Anytime I go out with my family or if I'm going on a trip, I always take the lighter lens because it fits in my bag. It's not as heavy. I'm not as worried if I drop my camera or my kid's taking pictures with it with a $60 lens on my camera. If you need a portrait lens, if you want to take your photography to the next level, I definitely recommend this Yongnuo 50mm lens. They have it for Nikon and Canon. And that brings me to my next point, is that the Canon lens is different. It is built a little bit differently, and I do not recommend it as much as the Nikon version because of those differences. So here's the Canon, and here's the Nikon. The Nikon is set up optically different. The lens elements are different. And the Canon lens, its autofocus is slower, and it's a lot louder. but it's pretty much just like the Canon 50mm, which is not as good as the Nikon 50mm, at least the 1.8 versions. So if you have a Canon, I recommend buying the Canon 50mm lens because it's only about $100, so it's not as expensive as the Nikon version. And this Yongnuo for Canon is not nearly as good as the Nikon version, simply due to the autofocus. So the bottom line is I've shot with probably 6 different 50mm lenses over the past 10 years. I've shot with Nikon 1.8s, 1.4s, Sigma 1.4, and then the 1.4 Art. I've shot with all kinds of lenses over the past 10 years, and this holds its own. It's a pretty awesome lens for $60. I highly recommend it to anybody looking to take their photography to the next level. If you get this lens, you will not be disappointed. If you already have a super expensive lens, definitely keep the super expensive lens. But if you're looking to buy a 50mm and you don't have one, I definitely recommend it.